Welcome to the weekly series of Healthcare Scene Google Plus Hangouts, where we sit down with top leaders in healthcare IT. Before we begin, I want to remind those watching live that you can submit any questions you have for us on the Google Plus event page. Today, we're excited to have Ron King, VP of Business Development and Operations at Comtron, makers of the Medgen EHR. Before joining Comtron, Ron King worked as the Executive Director of ACO and Specialty Practices at North Country Hospital, along with a number of business development and consulting opportunities in healthcare. At Comtron, Ron King is responsible for helping medical practices leverage software to improve provider satisfaction, care coordination, outcomes, and optimize workflows, all important topics that we'll talk about today, and I'm really pleased to have you here with me today, Ron.
Thank you, John. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about our product line on Medgen and take this time to fill you in on what's going on Medgen now and what we're planning on over the next few years.
Excellent. So, let's kick this off. You recently joined the Comtron team, and what really motivated you to do that? To move to an EHR vendor.
Sure. Yeah. As you were saying earlier, I have a hospital background, hospital operations background, and medical group operations background. I've been in that healthcare for just about 20 years now. And one of the patterns that I continue to see working with multiple EHR vendors and technology and software vendors is a significant impact on operations, finance operations, slowing processes down, and not really a good collective view of what's important and what's valuable within the system when communication with hospitals and physician practices. So I think continuing to see that kind of environment and seeing that there's other opportunities to improve things and make systems changes really got me focused on wanting to get involved and get engaged with a company that really understands what's important and how we can be very nimble and customize things to meet the different challenges that the organizations need.
Excellent. I think we want to dig into the EHR dissatisfaction later, but before we get into that, there's 300, maybe more. I mean, I think there's 600 listed on ONC's Chapel website of certified EHR vendors. So what makes the Medgen EHR unique?
Comtron as a whole, as a parent company, was started, and it's been around for about 25 years, which is a real major anomaly in the industry of healthcare technology. It was created by a really bright gentleman, David Lalazar, as a technologist and programmer, and he devised essentially a low-cost solution system to help physician practices 25 years ago communicate to hospitals and then hospitals back to practices. That's really where the foundation was. It was all about quality, and he focused on customer service. So when he developed an LIS system, he clearly kept that same focus. The LIS system grew from that same methodology, focusing on communications and focusing on customization. That's a huge piece. When he moved into the physician practice space with the EHR with Medgen, he kept the same focus and the same direction, making Medgen a product that's extremely customizable. One of the rigidities of a standard EHR systems that I've worked with over the years in the hospital setting has really not lent itself the ability to take different practices and specialties or even different workflows and make them adopt to what the workflow design needs to be to allow the provider and patient experience to continue to be strong. The Medgen system as a whole and the way the culture works and the way the programming works allows that. So if we walk into a practice and they have a specific workflow, they have a specific need, depending on the specialty, we just essentially make that happen. We don't try to bolt on a system and ask them to work within what we have for a product. We ask them what they need first, and then we essentially develop and wrap something around what their needs are, and they walk away a very satisfied customer.
That's really interesting that you said he started with quality, because I've long made the argument that EHR vendors were really big billing systems. They started as big billing systems, and now they're big meaningful use compliance systems. So it's interesting that you started with quality as opposed to it. Is that why you chose to go the customization route, do you think? Or that's a very different approach than what you've seen in the market.
Yeah, that's exactly why we focus on that. We want quality outcomes for the provider and the patient. One of the biggest, obviously, barriers, which we're going to talk about later, for the provider and all the providers I've worked with in the Northeast, is the inability to be able to pull themselves away from the EHR and the system, as they call it, and to be able to focus on what their key component is, which is the patient. And that's the biggest, one of the largest complaints. And rightfully so. And the patient feels that as well. So the patient encounter is felt to be cold or lack of engagement by the provider. They're busy slamming keys and trying to make things work within the system and trying to adapt their workflow to meet the EHR. The reason for this system being so customizable is the reason why I came to this particular company, and it's extremely important to the owner and CEO, David, and everyone that works within the team, the programmers, software engineers, technical support, all have the same culture and methodology, and that's the primary focus. And it was definitely the right decision, the right choice for me.
Interesting. So, I mean, it's interesting you said you want to release the doctor so they can focus on the patient, which is music to every doctor's ear that I know. How do you do that? Is it through the customization, or are there other things you do to help kind of relieve them of that lack of connection?
Sure. So we have a few tiered approach. There's a few things that we do unique. One, of course, is the customization that I keep speaking of. So if a provider, typically a provider, when he sits down with an EHR vendor, he'll look at his encounter form on her screen and say, it's great that you can do all these things and measure all these things, and the screen is so busy and so populated. That's great because it results in the metrics that you need for ACO or meaningful use, but not very relevant, not very helpful for me. All I want to see is A, B, and C. If I could take my screen and only see these three things, because this is what's valuable to me when I want to see the patient, I would love that. So we make that happen, and it's just that simple. If they don't want to see aspects of what a standard encounter form would be or a standard note would be because it's not valuable to them, we make it go away. And more importantly, we teach their staff, their nurses or their medical assistants, we teach them how to make it go away because the needs may be different later on. So they don't need to employ us as an organization and go through an expensive customization to the EHR. We teach their groups to do it and be very nimble as their practice changes and their behaviors change. That's number one. And the second piece we focus an enormous amount on is workflow. A lot of people say they do workflow, and that's fantastic. So from my experience when I've worked with vendors, workflow really resulted in, let me show you how to use the equipment, let me show you how to use the software, and you click here and you click there, and that's what's always been described to me and has been designed as workflow. When we focus on workflow, we focus on people, and we focus on how people communicate between the provider and clinically and the MA or the nurse, and how the front end communicates back to the provider. And we always keep the same focus, which is the patient. The patient's in the center of all this workflow. So we look at where the patient moves, how they move there, and is it really essential? Is there value added in what people are doing? Is there value added in what the provider does, or is there no value added? And the same thing for the clinical support staff that works with the provider. So we focus an enormous amount on workflow by looking at value stream mapping and process flow charting. And we like to graphically show them what they're doing right now for a workflow, how much that actually costs, and inefficiencies and where they may be. And we let them take part of the process as a team member to make the changes in the workflow. So we give them the designs, we give them the concepts, and we show them the opportunities. And then you'll see over a period of time between customization and workflow redesign that there's a much happier provider-patient relationship.
So let's talk about that. I mean, we read all the reports and you hear all the doctors, even a hashtag EHR backlash, right, with all the providers that aren't satisfied with their EHR software. Which I think you kind of addressed some of that in the customization, makes a more personalized experience, things like that. My question's always been, with the complexities of billing and the complexities of meaningful use, can you make an EHR system that would be satisfactory to doctors, or are the regulations just making that almost impossible?
I think very much, and I think if you don't focus on workflow,
very much possible, or
very much possible.
Okay.
Yeah, it's very possible to do that. It is, and I think It's really about the engagement, and it's about the workflow. So the problem with the provider piece is if they in many cases, in many organizations, have become a really expensive administrative support person or secretary, because they're clicking and they're pointing and they're adding and they're subtracting and they're having to check things off that maybe they did or didn't do in order to ensure they have the right E&M level or ensure that they have the meaningful use measure calculated. So is there value added, again, in that workflow for having the provider do that, or is it better to have clinical support teams, administrative support teams doing that ahead of time and during the encounter and even post follow-up? And we really look at that. We focus on pre-analytic view, what's going on beforehand, and the post-analytic view. And that's a key component. So with the provider engagement, which is the important meat of this, and what's important is the patient. And they want to focus on the patient. That's the main focus. I want to do what I went to school for. We hear it all the time. I went to school for 15, 16, 17 years, and I didn't go to do that to come out and click and point on a computer screen. I've heard of documentation times of 4 to 6 hours a day from providers, and I'm working with a group now. It's a commonality. Providers are leaving after their day 11 o'clock at night, and 4 or 5 hours a day is spent documenting. And is there really value added in what they're documenting, or is there a better flow or better process? And who really needs to do documentation and for what? And that's the key component. So it can be designed to make the provider and put them in a better position if there's focus on it.
So, I mean, do you think that's really the key to EHR physician dissatisfaction, is that they've become data entry clerks as opposed to medical doctors?
Absolutely. I think that's a big component, especially, I hear that a lot, and I've worked with a lot of providers in the Northeast, and they end up putting data in, entering numbers and metrics that may or may not provide value. And you hear that a lot, especially in the specialty practice world. These measures are important for meaningful use or maybe ACO, but is there value added? I'm a small bone, hand bone orthopedic surgeon, and you want me to address these components or check this button. The last time they may have seen that, part of the anatomy may have been, in residency, or there's just not a lot of value in it for them. It slows them down. And when they slow down, it costs the organization, the system, a lot of money, number one. And number two, it frustrates providers. And many providers are leaving their careers or doing something else because of that reason. They want to see the patient. They want to take care of sick people. And they're good at it. And that's where they want to put their primary focus.
Interesting. So, obviously, kind of overarching all of this is the regulations around meaningful use. You guys are 2014 certified, if I understand correctly. So what's been your users' reactions to meaningful use? Have you been able to incorporate it in a thoughtful way that it hasn't impacted dissatisfaction, or what's been their reaction to it?
Yeah, the reaction's been positive. Obviously, the initial reaction when they seen the regulatory changes come out and the timelines, of course, in many cases, what occurs is providers may wait the 11th hour because of the delay. So that's
never.
That's the first barrier that we have to overcome. And then when usually it's the practice manager or the provider that finally comes along and says, "I guess I have to do this." So the good news is when we get down there and we have to do it, we have a system where we focus on remote opportunities in education and training. We have a pragmatic approach. In many cases, what we've seen is it's the education that is lacking. That's the largest gap. Everyone has heard, if you're in healthcare, about meaningful use. If you really sit down and talk to people and do surveys, how many people really understand it and what's important, what isn't, what does it impact, you're going to find a large gap. Especially on the provider side. So we pay attention and we focus a lot on educating the provider or the practice manager or both first. What is it? Where do you find it? Why is it important? How does it link to reimbursement? What are the penalties somewhere down the road? And there's a huge education gap there. And then we pragmatically push them through the process. And that's, again, goes back to the benefit of the EHR and the way we can customize it. We have really easy ways to flag patients and to show a provider and show a practice manager or a nurse when a patient is indicated for a meaningful use measure. Make sure you don't forget this. Make sure you don't forget that. That kind of reflex reminder really automates the system and really puts the practice in a position where they really have to work hard to not do it right and not do it well.
You have to try to fail.
You do, a really focused effort.
Nice. So, do you think that the incentives are driving more of the adoption of meaningful use, or do you think the penalties are more motivating for your users?
I think for our users, it's really a mixture of both. I really thought it was driven based on incentivization to begin with. But as I've seen when we've actually educated more providers and more practices, we've seen that the penalties, which they were not either aware of the ramifications, or as that word has kind of spread, there are going to be penalties. It's going to be a percentage. When it comes, how it comes is pretty clearly defined. That's put a different sense of urgency on for sure. Incentivization is a great concept to move it forward. There has to be incentives. Financial incentives are good. I also think operational incentives really need to play a role in that. And I think there's other opportunities to bring other incentivization in there. But the penalties really I start to hear more and more about as it gets closer, of course.
Sure. Well, I think, speaking of incentives and costs, I think, associated with this, you guys have a really interesting freemium EHR model, which, I haven't seen in much of the industry. Tell us a little bit about your business model. How do you approach it, and how do you want to, help physicians in this? I think you have a unique approach that I haven't seen other places.
Sure. So, one of the things that we've seen as I work with in vendors is you have kind of this pragmatic or module-based EHR. So you have the EHR, and it has a fixed cost per month onboarding, and then you have, if you want to add on these other things such as practice management, revenue cycles, things of that nature, and you kind of keep adding on a piece here and a piece there and another piece, and eventually you get the complete EHR solution that you need. There is some advantages to that, but there's also a lot of disadvantages. So our premium EHR model is really everything is there. All the pieces that you need, all the tools, the toolkit, the business intelligence data, the reporting tools, practice management, productivity tools, and the fully robust EHR with meaningful use report cards and metrics, ACO modeling and metrics. Everything is there. And it's there for a very low cost when looking at competitors. And that's a key component. So we don't try to kind of bait and switch or kind of bring them in on a lower performing platform and then ask them to add on later on down the road. We roll it out as a really robust system and all-encompassing, and we really want to make sure that the system they have is going to be able to deliver what they need.
So, I think that's actually an interesting transition to your background. You formerly were, I think, director of an ACO, executive director at an ACO. And I think much like meaningful use, many doctors don't really know. They've heard the term ACO, they've heard value-based reimbursement, but, what should a doctor today really know about an ACO?
Sure. I think, some of the providers, many providers out there who are not in an ACO yet are kind of on the fence. They have one foot on the dock and the other one on the boat. I think one of the concerns that providers have or practices have, especially independents, is the ACO is kind of the mothership coming in and taking over. And they're going to change culture, format, expectation, and they have a whole bullet list of things that are going to, quote, happen to them. And I think the other perspective that I hear quite often is the providers or the hospitals are trying to create an ACO. And I think really what's important is they need to be engaged and understand that they can be involved in an ACO, to take part in an ACO, to not make decisions where they have to start from scratch and try to reinvent the wheel. That's what I would urge. A lot of providers or practices are focusing a lot of labor hours or costs on themselves to try to reinvent the wheel and create a process improvement strategy that mimics or runs a parallel environment to an ACO, but because they don't want to say they're engaged in an ACO with a large system. And that's not advisable. I think the advice I would have and the suggestion I would have is to take part in an ACO that's being successful, that has a system, it has a process, it has all the tools, and allow those tools to come in and wrap around your current system. The reality is the reimbursement model is changing. That's not going to go away, and it's more focused on quality and outcomes and less on volume. That's not a bad thing. The real basic concepts of an ACO are not horrible. They really aren't.
No.
It's what's important. We want to focus on the value, the outcome. The reality is, providers and practices, depending on the location, may manage the condition or disease very, very differently. And what has never been looked at really closely until now is, what is the outcome of that patient? Is it different? Are they living longer, living less? Are they sicker? Is it more expensive? And now that we're looking at that data and those metrics, the answer is yes. If you have variability in management and treatment of a condition, it's going to cost more, and the patient outcome may not be as well. So standardizing the care model that's going to get the best outcome is critical, and that's one of the main functionalities of ACO. So getting engaged and being involved is an important piece. Not being concerned or scared that this is going to be an over-encompassing model that's going to take away their autonomy, and I think that's the biggest thing.
That's interesting. I think many doctors are concerned, though, because they're afraid to tie their boat to the hospital or whoever might be running the ACO, because they're so used to that autonomy. But you're saying that that shouldn't be a fear. They can still be in an ACO, but still have their ability to, and freedom to practice the way they want.
Yeah, I think practicing the way they want and seeing the patients and caring for the patients they want. The reality is, I think, when we look at anything, any process or anything we do, there's really only 2 or 3 good ways to do something the right way and to get the best outcome, and that's the reality of it. So I think following a few different options and standards of care, 1 or 2 standards of care, makes lots of sense, because at the end of the day, the provider wants to get the best outcome for the patient. That's their goal. So if they have a few different paths to pick, that makes sense, and also we can clearly define and show the provider, regardless of the discipline, that the outcome will be ideal if you follow one of these paths. I think it would be very difficult for them to kind of argue that point. The loss of autonomy really would not be there if they took the time to really be educated. And I think that's a key component. Again, there's a huge gap in education, and there needs to be a significant increase in the education on the ACO modeling, and why it's important and what the value is. Because it's so much in the infancy stage right now, I think it's difficult, because a lot of providers, and rightfully so, are kind of standing back and saying, okay, I've seen this before. It was called managed care, HMOs. That didn't go so well, so now what do you have? So I think, but I think clearly this is focused on the patient, and that's the difference. Focus on the patient, and the outcomes have to be clearly defined. The provider can take part of that and engage in it, and really define what the outcomes can and can't be. And they can also help customize the care delivery model, and that's the ultimate autonomy, to be able to customize what happens with that care delivery model if they're part of an ACO team. If they don't take part in the ACO team, it's just going to happen.
Interesting. I think that's a really interesting approach, because I think they are afraid of it. What's happening with ACOs, and I think they're just unsure because it is so new, and they're unable to comprehend exactly what's happening in the process. So I think the education is key. Although I've also heard people say, well, the reason HMOs went bad is because the doctors didn't get involved. They didn't participate in the discussion, and so when they didn't, that's why it ended up the way it did.
That's correct, and this is the opportunity. This is different. So the providers have the opportunities here to become ACO board members, team members. There are many aspects of the ACOs that providers are encouraged to be involved in. In every ACO meeting or conference or anything I've been to, as far as an infrastructure board, always have providers on them making decisions. These are not providers that have not been in the practice setting for 25 years. These are active providers seeing patients, and they're making clinical decisions based on that. Here is the outcome we need, here's the metric, and let's design a clinical pathway that makes sense. Here are some recommendations and suggestions of what gets the best outcome, of what will fit and tailor within our system. It's really about that, and no other time has there been the opportunity to sit across the table and allow providers to be fully engaged and to drive this.
Sure. No, I think that's really interesting. The other thing that I think, I've made the point that ACOs can't exist without technology. So to me, I'd be interested to hear what technologies do you think doctors should be adopting that are going to form the backbone of these ACOs? Because it has to be all data-driven. So I think technology, to me, has to capture that data. Do you agree, or what's your assessment?
I completely agree with that. They have to have a fully adopted, EHR, as I defined, like our premium model, for example, and systems like it. To get an EHR that doesn't have business intelligence reports or data or analytics or the ability to measure and pull data and push data will be irrelevant for them. I completely agree. They need to have the proper technology in order to be engaged in an ACO or even meaningful use. It's also extremely important on the technology side is only as good as the person reading the technology and the data that comes out of it. So I think the other piece that's really critical for a provider practice being engaged in ACO is having someone involved in the practice that's really analytic driven. And that, I think that's critical and that's important. So someone understands process and lean and analytics and data and how to put that into a usable format for a provider and a medical group to make a decision on. Those are two pieces that are critically important.
Interesting. So, what are the challenges you see in the EHR industry that no one's really talking about, or maybe that's not getting enough attention? What do you see out there?
Sure. So I think, one of the things we talk a lot about on the hospital side is, what are our most expensive resources? And those resources really are revolved around labor. We know that's one of the most expensive out there, affecting hospitals and medical practices. The other piece we know that's really expensive for us is supply chain management. I see a lot about supply chain management, materials and supplies and where they come from. And, many hospitals are involved in large groups to try to get the best price. But when you start breaking it out to the provider level and the practices that are not involved in big buying groups through a hospital system, there's a gap. In many cases, practices are paying a premium for supplies and materials and consumables, and I don't see that as a big focus right now at the practice level, and I really think it needs to be part of a focus for sure.
Interesting. The technology could bring that together in an interesting way. I like it. Yeah. So where do you think Medgen EHR software will be 5 to 10 years from now? Where are you guys headed? What's next?
Sure. We're going to continue with our model of being extremely nimble, very customizable, and we're essentially redesigning the program right now from scratch, from the foundation up. We have really bright programmers working on it, using that culture and that methodology. So that's step one. We're going to focus a lot of other strategies. One of them is going to be how do we incorporate what I just said, the supply chain management model and aspect, and allow that to be a tool to happen in the practices, for efficiency improvement in pricing and structure and analytics to go along with it, of course. I think we're also going to focus a lot on telemedicine. Telemedicine is going to be a key component. How do we reach out? How does the practice get into the patient's home in some cases? And how does the patient from their home get into the practice? I think looking at a cost reduction strategy, we remove the ability for the provider to drive around different homes with their bag and their stethoscope and see the patient. I think in many cases that's not feasible anymore. But do you really need to do that today and with today's technology? Can we incorporate better communications? Can we improve that? Or can we have a provider reach out for a certain specialty, 100 miles or 1,000 miles away? The answer is yes. So I think it's another key component we're going to focus on, and how do we incorporate all that technology in there.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate you offering your insights. We're at the end of our time, but thanks so much for joining us, and I'm sure we'll have you back again in the future.
Thank you. I appreciate the time.